Good evening, everyone. Sarah, so good to have you here when we are celebrating the International Coaching Week, where we have few of the best speakers coming from all across the world and speaking to the coaching community, not only in India, but worldwide as well. It gives me immense pleasure to represent ex-monks. Ex-monks, as we are aware, it's an ecosystem that brings to you the world-class coaches from all across the world for the personal transformation and leadership development. And it gives me immense pleasure to introduce to you Sarah. Sarah, who's a colleague because we represent the leadership circle in India. And Sarah is a colleague I've had the honor of having gone through a few of her workshops, having discussed few topics, few very intense topics like identity, like creative competencies, like reactive tendencies across the table while having lunch or dinner. So just to quickly brief you about who Sarah is a senior leadership consultant and executive coach with Full Circle Group and the Leadership Circle. Her areas of expertise revolve around evolving leaders and transforming organizations to respond adaptively. She primarily works with C-suite executives and board of directors with the top team individuals and collective leadership effectiveness. Sarah brings along 30 years of consulting experience, working at executive and board levels in the areas of leadership strategy and development, organizational change and issue resolution, effective system and group dynamics, and executive coaching and mentoring. You know, I remember the last conversation that I was having with Sarah, where Sarah mentioned something really beautiful, and that stayed with me. And the conversation was happening around when we were discussing about the reactive tendencies and the creative competencies. And I remember Sarah mentioned that it's extremely important to accept people the way they are, because the moment we are willing to accept them, they can actually crawl into the creative competencies. If not crawl, they might want to walk, or they would somewhere or the other, they would be able to manage that. So it does not really matter the pace at which you're moving away from the reactive tendencies and embracing the creative competencies for yourself. What is really important is that you are being aware that these are the reactive tendencies which are not supporting you. And that's where you move your journey and get into the leadership position that you would like to get into, the leadership role that you may want to embrace for yourself. And for that, Sarah is going to talk about how to leverage leadership effectiveness by making a reactive to creative mindset shift. What you can expect, the primarily three takeaways that you can expect from Sarah's conversation would be leaning into the creative competencies, the power of underlying beliefs and assumptions. And that's one of my favorite topics. In fact, Sarah, the next session that I'm doing at 6 o'clock, I'm going to talk about assumptions and how we can bring a small shift. What are assumptions? So thank you for helping us to get ourselves educated on that. Understanding the unconscious canceling effect of reactivity and how to tame it, accelerating your development individuality and collectively. So ladies and gentlemen, in case you've got any question as the session is going on, you may want to write it down in the question and answer forum, or in case you've got any comment, please feel free to write down in the chat. After 30 minutes, we'll be more than happy to take a break, a small break, where we'll be addressing your questions for 5 to 7 minutes window. After that, we'll start our journey again, and then we're going to address the question answer round at the end of the session. As you all know, that's a 75-minute session, including 15 minutes of question answer round. Could be a possibility that we might not be able to address all the questions. And we assure you, what we are going to do is we are going to write blogs, and we are going to place it on the website so that you can go and access them. The website is www.xmonks.com. We are official partners to the Leadership Circle. And Sarah, thank you so much for representing the TLC and hoisting the flag really high. I'm looking forward to this conversation, Sarah. Thank you so much. Over to you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sarah. Sarah, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Gaurav. Seems such a special opportunity to be speaking to you all at this time, and the wonderful opportunity to actually be speaking to you in your homes and in your countries. And thank you, Gaurav, for such a warm welcome. I'm going to share my screen so that we can have a look at the concepts that I'm going to be talking about. And I want to give you an orientation to this notion of the leadership circle and the creative and the reactive, And so beautifully, we're going to begin. I just saw that actually my slides are in the wrong spot. So let's, sorry about that. Not a good way to begin.
So people want to ask you, how are you doing and how are you keeping safe in Australia?
Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, in Australia, we're very fortunate that in the very early times of COVID, they took very strong action. And so we went into, I think it was stage 3 lockdown over a matter of weeks. And we are now tracking very well. They're starting to ease the restrictions. And of course, we're in a similar situation to all of our human family members around the world. But I can say that we're doing quite well here. But of course, the economy has taken a very big hit. And now the focus is on how to enliven business again and do that in a staged way that will lead to good outcomes. And it's, I must say, in the leaders that I've been working with during this time, it's been very exciting to be talking about how to lead through this, what to be preparing for in terms of how to lead into the future, even when the future's unseen. And I have to say, some wonderful, wonderful innovations and dynamic changes in organizations and businesses. So the upside of something so very challenging for the human race is these turning points that appear when we are provoked in such a very, very strong and profound way in terms of making the changes that we need to make in business, in society, in all of the challenges that we're facing. So we're doing well, I have to say. So I just need to check. Can you see my screen? Are we all good to go now?
No, Sarah, we can't see your screen.
You can't see my screen. Okay, so let me just. I had everything all set up to go, and
then life happened.
And then life happened. Yes. Okay. So let me put one back. So this is me, as you've discovered. So just to give you this frame around the leadership circle, what we're really all about is evolving the conscious practice of leadership. And this is such an important phrase. How do we become conscious of the way in which we're showing up and what's going on within us that affects how we actually do things and the influence that we have and the way in which we lead? So developing this capacity to be very conscious about our practice in the way we go about leading. The leadership context that we use is one that I love dearly, and having come from a background, certainly in my personal interests, of the creative arts. So I was a singer and a dancer and all sorts of other creative pursuits in my life. And so this idea of leading, what is leadership all about? And it's about creating outcomes that matter to us. So, of course, we are right in the thick of it right now with COVID. There are many outcomes that matter to us deeply and profoundly, not just individually in our families, in our homes, but in our careers and in our businesses and in our organizations, and very graphically brought forward in our society as well. So this definition of leadership can connect at any level we care to reference. And this is really important, particularly when we're thinking about the creative frame of mind, because the creative frame of mind is this very thing. How do we create the outcomes that really matter to us? That has been informed by Robert Fritz's work, which he's a composer and a filmmaker. And this idea of how do you begin with a concept and then you mobilize all of the resources that you have in order to turn that concept into something real, something usable, something tangible, something that makes a difference. And so this is the leadership context that we're talking about. Now, it's no news to many of you, I'm sure, this idea of leading in a VUCA world. And maybe all of us, or a number of us, have talked about this idea even, thinking about the V for volatility. And as we contemplate in our current context, thinking about potential COVID spikes, what might provoke them, how might they come about, we can get a sense of how volatile, in fact, around the globe, we've experienced volatility with COVID in a very visceral way. So none of us don't understand this anymore. This idea of uncertainty, we do not know what our future holds for us. We can't see it. All of the governments around the world can't see it yet. We are in an unfolding situation where things could change at any time. Complexity, COVID is a beautiful illustration of complexity. If we think about how do you control this and how do you understand it, and even the complexity of which testing works and which one should you use and which one should you trust and why should you trust it and how could you trust it, and this is a very, very complex matter. Thinking about opening up again and easing lockdown is again this complexity of just how interconnected we all are in life around the globe. And then the A stands for ambiguity. I don't know what your experience was, but certainly our experience with the lockdown instructions was they were often confusing and ambiguous, and we didn't quite know what they meant. And so we had to find ways of either clarifying or actually making decisions ourselves about what was the best way to proceed in the absence of clarity from sources of authority. So that's a real live, we've all been thrown into this, this experience so that we understand absolutely right to our bones what it means to live in a VUCA world. And what that does is places a big challenge on us. And the thing we like to talk about is this complexity of context. So you can see there on the right that we have the VUCA world on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have the SCSC world. So that's the world of stability, certainty, simplicity, and clarity. And I don't know how many of you have moments of longing for that, but that's a common phenomenon when you're in a VUCA world and it's starting to feel overwhelming and you don't know how to make sense of it and you don't know how to respond to it, and your fears and anxieties get activated, and then we start longing for stability and certainty and simplicity and clarity. And invariably we go in search of it to calm ourselves down, but in fact it can often mean that it risks us being in an illusion that things are not as complex as they are. And when we look for simple answers and simple strategies, they have unintended effects that then come back and create more difficulties because we haven't understood the reality of our context. So the interesting thing about complexity of context is how does that match with our own complexity of ourselves? So our inner world and our ability inside of ourselves to manage, handle, embrace, and dare I say it, even seek out complexity to be able to engage with it and move forward. And of course, this is a very, very big demand in our world today, and especially it's live and real right now as we face into COVID. Now, this complexity of self, many people think that when we become adults, we've done all our development and now we're mature and we've got wisdom and perspective and we can work everything out. The only thing is that we usually reach that stage when we're somewhere in our 20s or 30s. And of course, there's a lot of development yet to go. There's a lot of life to be lived. There's a lot of experiences to be had. And as we do have those experiences, there are two ways that we can go. We can either grow through those experiences, and that produces an increasing capacity for complexity, or we search out simple, stable, certain answers that comfort us, and then we don't increase our complexity. We're not actually in development. Now, I would hope with an audience full of business people and coaches that in fact development is the way that you go, and therefore you understand about this evolution of development. I find that fascinating myself, that I'm deeply, deeply interested in staying a learner. I always say that I was stuck at 2 with a 2-year-old's curiosity, and that served me well because it keeps me being curious and inquiring, and that enhances my capacity to deal with complexity as it does for leaders. So these stages of development, if we think about the complexity of our context, and then it's the demand on our minds, how complex are our minds. So if we've developed internally the capacity for complexity, then when we find situations of complexity, we're not going to have so much difficulty with it. But if we haven't done that, then, and this is a very common phenomena, in fact, somewhere between 65 and 80% of people are at a lower stage of complexity of mind than the current circumstances in which we find ourselves. That means that there's a threshold differential between our consciousness and capacity for the complexity that we find ourselves in. So the leadership circle really is about addressing this developmental challenge. It's really designed to discover where are we in our stages of development, increasing our capacity for complexity and our ability to grapple with the VUCA world, to engage with it, and to actually be able to meet those challenges in a really effective way. And that's a very important issue for businesses and organizations, particularly in this context. So those who've been working in this area to enhance their capacity to deal with complexity will have an advantage in this context. Whereas those who are seeking to close the gap need to get their roller skates on, as we say, to actually accelerate their capacity to deal with the complexity. So if we look at these stages of development, that's there on the left-hand side. There's the reactive stage, which you've heard Gaurav reference, the reactive tendencies. There's the creative frame of mind, which I mentioned as we started. And then there's another form of complexity, which is the integral mind. And a very small percentage, around about 5% of the population are of integral mind. So we focus primarily on the reactive to the creative shift because this is the biggest shift that's going on in society. It doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to the creative to integral shift, because certainly if somebody's at that stage, we want to help them develop in that stage as well. But you can see there on the right-hand side that the leadership effectiveness at leaders at each of the stages of development is quite different. So you can see there at the reactive, their leadership effectiveness is averaged at the 40th percentile. Rated at the 40th percentile, whereas the creative is at the 65th percentile and the integral at the 90th percentile. So you can see that by making this reactive creative shift, by the way, it's the shift that needs to happen before the integral. You can't jump a stage because it's like a child has to crawl before it can walk and walk before it can run. And each stage before the current stage is a foundation to the current stage. So really important to harvest the benefits of the reactive and then move to the creative, then harvest the benefits of the creative and then move to integral. So these are the stages of development being referred to. Now, this just gives you a picture of the creative competencies that are represented on the top half and the reactive styles on the bottom half of the circle. And I'm going to take you more into that so you understand a little bit more about that. With the reactive, which is on the bottom half, there is a particular structure of mind in the reactive. And in the reactive, the reason why it's described as reactive is we react to our surrounds. In other words, our point of reference and our sense of who we are is very much determined by how other people see us and the influence that other people may have in our lives. So the orientation when there is a challenge or something that we need to attend to, such as a leadership challenge, we invariably get concerned. So it's a problem that needs to be fixed. And that would be our frame of reference. Here's a problem. My job as the leader is to fix the problem. So I need to get to it and fix it. Now, what's embedded in that, and you'll have this experience yourself when you have a problem, is that you feel some sort of angst about it. You feel a sense of responsibility, that you really need to attend to it, and that you need to do the best that you can to address it. And it's this angst itself that produces a reaction. And the reaction is designed to make sure that you are well regarded, that you've done your job well, that other people will think well of you. And so then your behavior is intended to actually make sure that people think well of you as you have defined it. And now you'll notice that your attention is not so much on what are you trying to bring into being. Your attention is more about this problem, this obstacle, this difficulty, and how do I get it to go away? And the standard of measure would be that it goes away. So here we have the problem. Then we have the reaction to the problem driven by some sort of internal angst. And then the behavior that we're acting, the way in which we're acting is to address the angst. And invariably the problem will go away. But what happens then is our desire for action goes down because the problem's disappeared. We can relax a little, not so edgy. And so our behavior corresponds. And what we can see is that then another problem comes along and we go into a reaction because of the problem, and then the behavior responds. And we get to see this pattern of results over time. And we call that a balancing or an oscillating loop, because it means that something like, come to the end of the month, the sales are down, I need to get the sales up to meet my target, do whatever I can to meet my target, including sometimes strategies like taking my sales from next month and putting them in this month, discounting so that I actually get the sales, a whole range of strategies which are designed to meet the target. And then once I've met the target, it's like, oh, great. Okay, I got there. That's fantastic. But I didn't notice that actually I've made the next month more difficult to achieve the target because of the strategies that I deployed. And so you can actually see then you have a good month, a bad month, a good month, a bad month, as you're reactively trying to address your sales issues. So that's just an illustration of that. Then you have the outcome creating, which is very different. So in the outcome creating, we get really clear about the outcome. And this could be the outcome of the conversation. It could be the outcome of a meeting. It could be the outcome of a project. It could be an outcome of our strategy, or it could be an outcome of the whole enterprise and what it's seeking to do. So the outcome can go from the micro to the macro. Our response typically in that is to be excited, inspired, and engaged, because if we get connected to things that we really care about, it gives us energy and it gives us a sense of purpose. It gives us a sense of meaning. By the way, that's something very important in COVID, that we have a sense of purpose and we have a sense of meaning, because it will have a calming effect in us. If we lose contact with that, we feel like we're a little bit at sea, and it's much more difficult to manage. So the response comes from the energy that it generates, and therefore the behavior that we take, the actions that we take, are intended to move us towards our outcome. And if they don't move us towards our outcome, typically with the outcome creating mindset, we're not bothered by that. It's not a problem. It's not an issue. It's information. It's feedback. That didn't work. Oh, okay, I need to look for what will work. And so it produces more energy. And hence why you can see there it's described as a growth or regenerative loop. So we have an outcome, we feel inspired by it, we respond to it because we feel energized. The behavior that we engage in and focus on is what will move us towards the outcome. So then our sense of the outcome expands, our response expands, and so on. So here we have the reactive version, which is anxiety containing. And the other expression you'll see there listed is identity maintaining. And what this means, this identity maintaining, is that I have a definition of who I am. Maybe I've got success that I've had over the years and I identify with that success. I identify with the strategies that I've used. And so because I'm maintaining an identity that I have from the past, I'm likely to stick with tried and true methods. Whereas on the outcome creating side, and you'll see that it's about potential unleashing, now I'm not so attached to the past. I know what I've done in the past. I can draw from that in terms of confidence, but I'm much more interested in where I might go or what I might become or what I might learn or how I might evolve. And they're two very different ways of standing in the world. And of course, the outcome creating is very, very generative and energizing, inspiring and uplifting. Whereas the problem reacting tends to be more challenging and there tends to be more resistance and difficulties in that. And that's why I use the term leveraging your leadership, because the more you can move into the creative orientation, the more leverage you're going to get from your leadership. And in fact, it makes leadership easier. I had a client once who I was coaching him for an extended period of time. We'd been working together for about 9 months. And he came in one day so excited. And I said, "What are you so excited about, Ian?" And he said, "I finally got what you're talking about. This leadership stuff is fun. It's really energizing. I've got everybody doing what they really care about and what they want. And that sets me free to do all of the things that I've been dying to get to. And it's making my job fun and exciting." And it was a lovely illustration of just how freeing it is when you can actually make that shift from dominantly being in a reactive orientation versus a creative orientation. So this is just to illustrate the different structures of mind. So in the reactive, it's problem focused. This fear is how I will be judged, what other people will think of me, whether I will get opportunities, whether I might be excluded, or those sorts of things. So it has anxiety within it. And just as a tip to the wise, it can be very subtle in its forms. So I find this a lot when I'm working with clients, that they can't see their reactivity. And it's because they're looking for something really obvious, something graphic. And for instance, I have a tendency towards being distant. And so when I'm warm, I'm very warm. And when I'm distant, it's like I'm not there. And so somebody on the receiving end will notice that very strongly, even though I just might say, "Oh, I'm just thinking about things." But I have actually withdrawn. And so the thing here with the reactive, and I know that whoever is going to be speaking about this, is to realize that it can show up in subtle forms and not really graphic forms. It can show up in graphic forms as well, so don't be surprised about that either. This zone of tolerable conflict is the idea that there's a certain amount of tension I can bear and there's a certain amount of tension I can't bear. And so that's what produces the swing. and why we call it the zone of tolerable conflict. And of course, development happens at the edge of that zone. When we move out of our comfort zone and into our discomfort zone, that's where development happens. And so in the reactive, we get shy of wanting to go into that zone rather than embracing it and stepping into it. So maintains the status quo. So we have a sense of equilibrium, which of course goes to that steady. So if we're looking for things to be steady and simple and predictable, you know, that's we'll go there. It can involve either passive or aggressive behaviors, which also can be subtle, so that they're not really graphic, but they're there nonetheless. And it also generates this helplessness in people, sometimes powerlessness and frustration and resistance. So these are all things that create impediments in relationships. So the creative orientation, here you can see, I'll just go through it quickly. It's vision focused, it's led by inspiration and a sense of purpose. It's generative, it's adaptive, it's creative, and it's innovative. And it generates, establishes and generates momentum. And it uses this idea of creative tension, which I'm going to come back to, because if you can understand how creative tension works, your street's ahead. It challenges the status quo, but it does so in a way that's about advancing things that matter. It's not done out of a rebellious stance. The rebellious stance would come out of the reactive. Whereas challenging the status quo in this context is it's felt like it's expansive and developmental. So, and I've mentioned about the energy that it creates. So, I love this image. Talking about the creative orientation, one of the key things is that we have a sense of purpose and a sense of vision. And the reason I picked this image is, one, because the light in it creates a sense of inspiration. The other thing that's important about this image is it's something that we want to move towards. So the hand's reaching out for it. So it's something we care about. It's something we feel inspired by. And by the way, it's not so clear as it's very, very concrete. It's more like this image shows. We have a sense of it. And the reason why we want to have this kind of sense of it, but not be able to draw it exactly, is because the space allows for serendipities. It allows for things that we couldn't have imagined until we were in the process. If we're too concrete about it and too specific about it, it becomes limiting. And this now becomes more like grasping at something rather than reaching out for something. So we can get a sense of purpose in every interaction we have, in every single initiative that we do in a family context, in a business context. If we stop for a moment, instead of rushing headlong in and just following our natural impulse, and get clear about what would a great outcome be? What would it look like? What would it contain? What would its qualities be? How would it be for me? How would it be for the others? If we don't stop and think about what would inspire other people as well as us, we're not going to get them to come with us. So this is the first ingredient of creative tension, which is an essential discipline of the creative orientation. And of course, this requires us to have a capacity for imagining possible futures. Right now in COVID, that's so important, that we can imagine possible futures and not be attached to them as if we would be disappointed if they didn't occur. But it's like that childlike wonder of saying, what if this, and what if that, and what if that, and what if that? And having lots of possibilities, and of course, even the possibility that something that you haven't thought of. And it's interesting because if you look at the writings of Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz, afterwards, and he's a psychologist, afterwards he wrote a book about this. And the people who survived were the people who believed in life beyond Auschwitz. And the optimist inside who said, by Christmas, or by Easter, or, you know, referencing against when it would all get better, their deep, deep disappointment at it not coming out was eventually what led to depression and there being them not surviving. Same happened with Stockdale, General Stockdale, who was in Vietnam in a prisoner of war camp, and exactly the same thing. When he came out, they asked him, how did you survive? And he said, I'm not an optimist. I just believed in my future. And so this is really important in terms of the creative orientation, that we understand what is it that will pull us forward. What do we care enough about that we would actually take some risks? We would be willing to experiment with things that are uncomfortable, because the prize is worth it. What we're going for matters so much. So that brings us to this notion of creative tension. And creative tension, you will have all experienced. Now, I don't know whether all of you have learnt to ride a bike. Some of you may have not been interested in the thrills and spills of succeeding at riding a bike, but I thought it was a fairly safe one to pick as an illustration. When you start out to ride a bike, mostly what children are inspired and excited about is the freedom, the capacity for them to move around, to go places with their friends, the exhilaration of having the speed and the movement, you know, to move beyond walking and running, but to get even more expansive with our energy. Now, there are some children who actually are not interested in that, and they'll try to ride a bike, and when they have the spills and thrills and maybe hurt themselves like I did, I ran into a tree when I was learning to ride a bike and broke my nose. But I so wanted to ride a bike that the broken nose wasn't going to get in the way. But, you know, for lots of people, a broken nose would have stopped them riding the bike. And so this is, how do we process the difficulties that we have when we go after something that we really care about? And of course, this is juxtaposing what's actually present, our current reality, and are we grounded in our current reality? That when I broke my nose on riding the bike, that meant I couldn't go flying down the driveway, the steep driveway, because it was too risky of doing more things. I had to back off and actually get my nose repaired before I could go back to the adventuresome kind of bike riding antics. And this is what the creative tension is. It's the vision that we hold, the current reality. How do we calibrate against current reality and against the vision that we hold? And in fact, we're actually creating this tension that is full of potential. It's full of energy. It's full of momentum. And actually, what some people do when they feel tension like that is they try to get rid of it. So in other words, they collapse the vision or they distort reality and don't see it as it really is. And for those of you who are coaches, you know how important that is when you're coaching with somebody, that they actually do get in touch with their reality, you know, how they're seen, how they're experienced. Because if they can get in touch with that, then you can actually do work, you can develop. But if they try to distort it and avoid it, then it's hard to do the development. They don't have the information that they need in order to develop. So developing this capacity to hold this creative tension is really, really crucial. Not sure what happened there. I wanted to take you into the creative competencies, and maybe I'll just pause there, Gaurav, to just see if there's any questions or comments that people might have before I dive into the creative competencies. Is that a good idea?
Absolutely, yes. So I feel there are many questions which are
piling up,
which people have. Okay, so let me start with this. let's start with the first question. It says, so there's a question called, if you can just explain a little bit on generative adulthood and adaptive childhood. So.
Oh, adaptive childhood and generative, yeah.
Adulthood, yes.
Adulthood, yeah. So adaptive childhood is literally what experiences have you had and how have you integrated those experiences so that they're developmental. So for instance, my parents got divorced when I was 5 years old. And my mother was, at that time, she had a very serious riding accident and she was crippled. And interestingly, when I became an adult, I realized how I processed that because I wanted to be an occupational therapist. So it was like I watched my mother recover, and it inspired me to work with people who wanted to recover. It didn't become a trauma in my life. What it became was an inspiration in my life. Now, that's having an adaptive experience in your childhood. That isn't, we're not always surrounded by supports or the things that might produce that adaptive response, but also that's part of our parents' responsibility, is when we have challenges or difficulties, how do we turn them into opportunities of growth, rather than we can wrap our children up in cotton wool and then they don't become developmental opportunities. They actually come, you can generate fear and anxiety by, for instance, being overprotective of children rather than building their confidence for their capability to handle things that come along. So that's adaptive childhood. Generative adulthood is, I'm probably a living, breathing example of it, where whatever happens, I ask, what is there for me to learn? So I'm really fascinated, just to give you an illustration, with COVID, I'm like everybody else. I have family and I have children and I have grandchildren. And, you know, my son lost his job and bless him, he's found another one. So and he ended up getting his dream job. So that's a miracle in that happening in COVID. But so watching that, my 90-year-old mother lives with me. So we've got to be very, very careful to protect her health and make sure that she's safe. So, you know, very serious things to attend to. And at the same time, I'm very curious about, where is this taking us? What are the opportunities? What is there for us to learn? How are we going to become, like, I look at all of the issues that are arising out of COVID, and they're pointing to our work. What is our work with society? What are the things that we actually have not been paying attention to that we now need to pay attention to? And that's really taking a generative view rather than seeing it as a crisis and being overwhelmed by it. It is a crisis and there are things that require attention, but to not allow them to overwhelm, to get in contact with our resourcefulness. And of course, this is when we need each other as well. You know, this is definitely, you know, I know who to reach out to when I need support, and I know the signs that, you know, how to get that and what to do. So does that help explain?
Yes, Sarah, thank you so much. In fact, you know, this reminds me of, so there's another speaker coming to speak about a 4D approach to coaching, where he's talking about the 4Ds, where he's talking about the destiny, the drama, the deliberation, and the development. And very metaphorically, he explains it's not what happens to us, it's the meaning that we create in that experience that makes all the difference. And I'll be touching on this in a while at 6 o'clock. At the same time, I think this approach is beautiful. In the metaphor that Julius uses is, he says that either you can drive a car looking at the rear mirror, or you can look at the future that you want to create for yourself and start driving in that direction. So Sarah, thank you so much for sharing that. There's another question which is very similar to what you've just mentioned here. Are you referring that outcome creating is more future centric?
Not necessarily more future centric. So it could be Like, for instance, perhaps you have a situation in the family currently that you need to attend to, and you need to think about, well, so in this sense, it's the future. What would a really good outcome be? But it's not a long future. You know, it's more like, if we were to have this conversation, what would a good conversation look like? How would everybody feel at the end of the conversation? What would we have achieved by the end of the conversation? How would that be useful for us? So can you see, it can be something present, even though obviously in a timeline it is the future in the strictest sense, but it's actually something material right now. Or it could be something much longer term, that maybe even needs chunking down into a series of things. So yeah, it doesn't have to be future oriented. It's more about understanding that we are agents of our own life, and what sort of agent for our life do we want to be.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we would be sharing this recording. It would be available on our website in a couple of days' time. We'll just put it together and we'll place it. So you may want to access it on the website itself. So does that mean it's about opening new alternatives and outcome creating?
Absolutely. Outcome creating is, by its very nature, bringing into being what you really care about and what really matters. That's going to be very important for all of us as we go forward here. What sorts of things do we want to create in our work? What do we want to create in our lives? I think that that's a very big provocation for just about everybody in this situation. It's causing people to think about, you know, how do they look after themselves? How do they look after each other? So yeah, it's really designing the kind of life that we want and the world that we want.
There's another wonderful question, Neetu, and I'm sure many people would have asked you this question as well. How do you realize when you are reactive on some things and creative on others? So,
beautiful. That's coming attractions. Shall we
yes.
keep going?
Please
Does
go
that
ahead,
sound like good? Yeah.
because this is
Yeah.
one of my favorite questions. And I remember when Bill was talking about, sorry, when Bob was talking about this, and the metaphorically he asked people that, okay, let's start singing, and the way he actually illustrated that in the face-to-face session, that was beautiful for me. So I'll leave it to you. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, let me just show you a little bit about the creative competencies so you get a sense of them, because what I want to do is help you see how the creative, you can think that you're being creative, but you're actually being reactive, which goes very much to this question. So here on the top half, the creative competencies, we've got relating, and you can see that's made up of caring, connection, fostering team play, collaborator, mentoring, developing, and interpersonal intelligence. And I'll just whiz around so you get a sense of it first. Then there's self-awareness in this next grouping. So that's selfless leader. So that's being a servant leader. Balance, so that you can step back and take a perspective. And so you've got some balance. You're not always full throttle, full drive. Composure is the ability. Composure is something you need right now. Leaders need right now, really, you know, that's the first thing, that you have composure in this context. Personal learner is the ability to learn from any situation or circumstance, but particularly to know how you impact both yourself and others by the way that you do things. So critical personal learner to know the difference between reactive and creative. There's authenticity. So integrity is walking your talk, and courageous authenticity is speaking up, especially when it's difficult. Systems awareness, so community concern, sustainable productivity and systems thinking. And then achieving is strategic, focus, purposeful and visionary, achieves results and decisiveness. I've just highlighted in red the competencies that are very much needed right now in COVID. So caring connections needed, collaborators needed, composure's needed, personal learner, community concern, and purposeful and visionary. So you know, you could almost if you focused on dialing those up right now, that'd be fantastic. That's going to help. So it gives
Thank
you
you, Sarah. I just want to add one more line here. My apologies here. In fact, we have just concluded a survey here where 800 people responded to that survey. And when we asked, what do you think? What are the primary competencies which are required under the influence of COVID-19 and post that to help organization not only sustain but grow as well? Number one thing that they mentioned was empathy and connections, right? Number two, they mentioned was dealing with ambiguity. Then they spoke about the way they connect, the managers and the leaders, they connect with their team members. And they maintain their composure under tough situation, because under tough situations, the nastiest of our behavior, they come on the surface and we forget what we really stand for. So, and that is what connects with purposeful and visionary. So thank you for bringing that more alive for all of us. And ladies and gentlemen, we would be doing the summary of the survey that I'm talking about on 9th at 6 o'clock, where we'll have 3 leaders from the Indian fraternity as well as globally, where they are going to talk about and they are going to share their understanding of the way leadership should be, and the business continuity will going to show up. So please register for that event as well. Sarah, over to you. Sorry.
Oh, lovely. That's okay. So if we look at these competencies, like, they all make sense, and you know, most leaders would be trying to do that when they're leading, right? But it's interesting, when do we show, if we take, for instance, caring connection. So one of the things, how many people have heard of too much Zoom calls, too many connections, not enough time for self, getting overwhelmed by how much people are reaching out. So of course it's caring connection on the one hand, but it's reactive caring connection, right? Because it's actually not in the right measure. It's not meeting people where they need to be met. So on the one hand, you could think I'm doing caring connection, but on the other hand, you might actually be meeting your needs for connection, but not actually respecting others' needs. So this is where the reactivity can show, and you don't realize that it's showing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. So here's the thing. And I know that Gaurav, you're going to do more on this. I'm not going to do a whole lot, but I want to touch on it, because it's what beliefs and assumptions do you hold. So when you have this need to reach out and to reach out to others, what's driving that? What's the mindset that's driving that? And typically we know it's reactive when it's for you, and that it's creative when it's for the greater good. So and it's an interesting thing, because we can manipulate ourselves to say what we're doing is for the greater good, even though it's really for us. And this is the work of distinguishing between the reactive and the creative, because the distinguishing feature between them is there's some underlying anxiety about your sense of safety, or your sense of security, or your sense of worth. And so if that's getting activated, and we know because we can feel it in our bodies, it shows up in your body as tension somewhere, if it's in your jaw, if it's in your chest, and learning to listen and pay attention to your body, because your body gives you the signals of your reactivity. It's not so much your mind that gives the signals, it's actually your body. Anytime you feel out of harmony in your body, or even it can be numb in your body. So you're not feeling at all, you can't actually sense it. But when there's a disturbance, and you know when you're at peace in your body. So this is a first sign. And the second thing that we need to be is, and I know, Gaurav, that you'll be talking more about this, and others will be talking more about this. What meaning do you make of your experiences? So if we make a meaning that produces angst, that diminishes us, that generates a sense of fear or anxiety or sense of inadequacy or limitation or whatever, that's actually going to activate the reactive as a natural, normal, healthy device. because the reactive is designed to protect you from those moments of anxiety. It's what we do to manage our anxiety. But we do it automatically rather than consciously. And that takes us back to the conscious practice of leadership. Because if I can notice when I'm actually, the meaning that I'm making is putting me into anxiety, and then that's driving behaviors that aren't helpful, and I can notice that those behaviors aren't helpful, then I can actually do some self-soothing, whatever it is I need to do to manage my inner world. And then I can make different choices because I now can see new choices. Whereas if the reactive is driving it, I can't see the choices. I don't believe I have any. I'm just doing what I have to do to feel safe or to take care of myself. And that can be very real when the reactive is activated. I asked some clients, we were doing a group workshop, and they said, we want to lean more into courageous authenticity. And I said, well, why don't you list what the behaviors are? And these are the behaviors that they listed. And you can read that, so I'm not going to read through it. But then I said, well, what beliefs and assumptions do you need to hold in order for you to practice courageous authenticity? And this is what they came up with. Now, there's more versions. There's no right or wrong here. But once they could see, I've got to have a relationship with these beliefs and assumptions in order for those behaviors to be possible, that was where the juice started to happen in their experience. So the second one here is they wanted to have more caring, connection, and fostering team play. So you can see there, they listed all the behaviors that they needed to do that. And this is a form of creative tension, you see. When you get somebody to describe how they would show up if they were doing that optimally, you've set the vision, you've set the outcome that they're going for. And then when we look at the beliefs and assumptions, it's actually what will make that possible. And what it does is help them realize what beliefs and assumptions they haven't been paying attention to. But most people have it within them. So it's a nice little illustration for you. So if we go into the context of COVID, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but these are the ones that I was just talking about before. But I think I might scoot through and go on to a little bit more about this reactive creative tension. But if I were to ask each of you, what are the beliefs and assumptions that you would need to hold to exercise these competencies? So for you to be present, calm, and resilient in difficult times, there's certain beliefs and assumptions you'd have to hold in order for that to be possible. Now, equally, if you think about some of the things that are happening, you can very easily go into your anxiety and discover beliefs and assumptions that will not strengthen you, that will not help you be present and calm and resilient, right? And if you're a normal human being, you'll have moments like that now. So you can actually notice, oh, this is what is happening when I am actually composed. I'm present and calm and resilient. Oh, and this is what's happening when I'm believing these other things. And then I become anxious and I start, potentially I'm short-tempered, or I'm not patient with people, or I start getting agitated, or I eat too much, or whatever it is that you do. So you can actually use these as a little way to calibrate, what are the beliefs and assumptions that help me lean into this versus what are the beliefs and assumptions that take me away from this. So there's two strategies you've got there, is paying attention to your body, what's actually going on in it. And the other is looking at, am I meaning making in a way that helps me do this, or am I meaning making in a way that takes me away from doing this? And I know, Gaurav, you're going to spend more time on that.
Yes, in fact, on this and connecting it back to the COVID-19 leader requires, there's a question, if you allow, may I ask you that question right now?
Sure.
Yeah. How can the movement from reactive to creative competency can be used as a combat in the game changer like COVID-19?
Oh,
I know you have
I'll,
addressed it in some way. And
yeah, no, I'll give you a really strong illustration, because I was talking with a CEO the other day, and he said, but we can't see the future. And I said, well, you need to set up creative tension, believing in that future. And if you think about it in reality, you're looking into a fog and you can't see what's in the fog. You absolutely can't see. And when you're driving in a fog, the thing that you want to do is get out of the fog or stop driving, because it's so damn difficult to see. And so you can see a lot of reactivity can potentially come up in those conditions. But if you understand you're not going to be able to see right now, but you need to keep looking, because as the fog lifts, there's going to be a silhouette. You're going to start seeing it. It will start to present itself. So here's a perfect example of looking, because that's what you have to do. You have to be looking for it. And you know that you're not going to see it until it appears. So you're not going to see it until it appears, but you have to be looking for it in order that when it starts to appear, you do actually see it. And this is this purposeful and visionary. The stronger organizations have about their sense of purpose and their vision, of what they stand for, what their service is to society. And then you take the community concern and think about, well, what's going on in society right now? And how is that relevant to us and what we do and how we serve society? And it may actually mean that you discover a whole new area of business that is going to be obvious to you as a result of this. But it won't happen unless you start getting deeply connected to what's the service you provide to society, what is the purpose of your enterprise, what is the talent, the resources, the things that you have, and what are the needs that are emerging that didn't exist before this. So already you can start to see that purposeful and visionary and community concern are strong. Then you've got to be in the personal learner state. To be in the personal learner state, you've got to be in composure. So what are you doing for your self-care so that you can be in a learning frame of mind? And one of the ways you're going to learn mostly is through engaging with others. And that brings you into your caring connection and your collaborator. So you can see how all of these feed into each other to be actually, if you're leaning into the beliefs and assumptions that support you being in that orientation, you're actually going to be navigating this difficult time in the most sensible way that you could be. And the more you can generate that throughout your system and your organization, you are developing your muscle of being in the creative orientation, and you are navigating the complexity that you find yourself in right now. Does that work, Gaurav? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Please go ahead,
So
Sarah. We have a couple of more questions, but I'll leave it to you.
Do you want? Yeah, go for the questions. I'll put this up while we're talking so that they're there.
There's one question: how does this model similar to DISC? We can address this in a while because I know you are in some flow. You're talking about reactive tendencies, so we can address this question. Does this model have some similarity with DISC?
Perhaps we can come to that because it sits differently in the world to DISC, but like lots of things, they have echoes between them. Yeah. The reactive structure, this is the complying and protecting and controlling. And I know you're going to go into this in much more detail later on, so I'm not going to go into it too much here. But other to say, I illustrated a little bit before about if I'm leading into caring connection and I have distance, which I've highlighted there as well, you can see that if the distance gets activated, it has a cancelling effect on the caring connection. Same with, let's say that I'm being, purposeful and visionary. But then I get autocratic, I get very directive about you should do this and you should do that and you should do the other. And then the other person doesn't experience me as purposeful and visionary. They experience me as bossy. And so this is interesting because even though we lean into the creative, if we do not have a line of sight to the reactive and how it plays out, it can be undermining our effectiveness outside of our awareness. So it's a real art form to be able to see how your reactivity gets activated and how it plays out and the impact that it has. And most of us are very uncomfortable looking at ourselves with such clear eyes. But this is what the Leadership Circle is actually designed to do. It's designed to help you see yourself clearly and find out where the gaps in your awareness are. Because what we know is when human beings can face reality and they're supported, they can deal with it. They're very good at dealing with it. The difficulty is facing it. But once they face it, there's a tremendous relief that comes. So there's this, I don't want to look at it, I don't want to look at it. And then when you look at it, it's like, oh, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. And then it's like, oh, I can actually do something about it. So this is very important. If we're wanting to move and leverage our capacity to deal with the complexity, that we actually have this capacity to see what's limiting. I can tell you it's such a relief once you see it, and once you can manage it, and once you can work with it. So this is the cancelling effect that I was talking about, where we can have reactive tethers. So if you think about a balloon and you have this beautiful gas and the fire and it pushes the balloon up, but if everything's all tethered, you're not going to go very far. And this is the cancelling effect that any of the reactive tendencies can have. And I had a beautiful example of this just recently with a client who was saying to me, I've been working with a client for quite a while. They were describing to me how wonderful everybody was, and how much support there was, and you know, everybody's together and they're communicating fabulously and they're getting great feedback and all this sort of thing. And I know that they have a tendency to be distant. And I said, oh, that's fantastic. I'm loving hearing about all of that. I said, I'm wondering what's happening to all of you introverts. What's happening to the people who need a bit of space? And, you know, because a lot of distance in an organization is the culture. There's a lot of people who need space. And they said to me, oh, that's really interesting that you would ask that question, because the feedbacks come back that people actually they're not having enough time for themselves. There's not enough, you know, it's just too full on. And I said, well, that is a trap of, if somebody has the tendency of distance and then they go into caring connection and fostering team play and collaborating and community concerns, they're doing all of those things. But their distance means that they're not very good at calibrating how much other people can handle. And she went, oh my goodness, I never thought of that. And I thought that that's a lovely illustration of a subtle thing that can have a significant effect, and people not realizing that actually that's having an effect. It was interesting because I had a conversation with the CEO similarly about some of his reactive tendencies and how they were playing out. And again, they were very subtle things that were happening, but when we shone a light on it, he actually realized that was what was frustrating him. And it was the cause of his frustration was his own reactive tendency. So once he could see it, and once he could see how it played out, then he could change it. But it was only when we could actually shine a light on it that he understood it, he could see it clearly, that he could actually change it. So this is a very important aspect that we find in the Leadership Circle material, that we can actually discover whilst somebody's doing great things and leaning into the creative, there are nuances about the reactive that if they can uncouple those tethers, then they get the fabulous uplift of all of their efforts and their good work that they're doing. But if we don't address those tethers, they can be very frustrated and limited because they're trying really, really hard and don't understand why it's not working. So that's a really important distinction. And I might just go, if there's any questions on that one. I'll share this. These comparing strengths and challenges, which is another way of speaking about the cancelling effect. So you can have on the one hand somebody's a people person, but you can see on the other hand they underdevelop their team or they micromanage. And so they have some things that go for them, and then they have some things that go against them. And so starting to understand which of the reactive tendencies that are having this drag effect is really, really important. Well, do you have
Sarah, we have another 3 minutes. So
Sure.
There's one question that you may want to address. It's a beautiful question. What's the role of conditioning and learning in both reactive and creative spheres? That's the last question. I know there are so many other questions around what does integral leadership mean. Pradeep we would have a, a blog on our website very soon. There are other questions like how are problem creativity, how are problem creating in past and narrowing present focused? What is the impact of creative competencies on the business performance in an organization? There are many questions, but I think you may want to pick up the last question. As I mentioned, what's the role of conditioning and learning in both reactive and creative spheres?
Well, conditioning is actually what can hold you in the reactive. So you get comfort from your conditioning. Whereas if you lean into learning, which is to revise and update your beliefs and assumptions, to revise and update the way in which you see the world, that opens you much more into the creative orientation. You could actually make a comparison between Carol Dweck's work around the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. So conditioning tends to sit you in the fixed mindset, unless of course you've been conditioned to learn. And then your conditioning can actually help you with the learning. So, yeah. Do you want me to wrap up there?
Yes.
Yeah, let me just take you to one last slide that I wanted to share with you. Here we go. This is what I just wanted to offer with you. If you try to do this work as an individual, that's a phenomenal investment and very, very worthwhile. But when you actually join with others and you're having these conversations together, you actually leverage your learning, because by doing it in a community, you're actually normalizing your development and getting support from each other. If you expand that into a team so that a whole team is doing it, so you go from individual coaching to paired coaching to trio coaching to team coaching, and then you go to system coaching. When you do that for the reactive to creative shift, you really accelerate your capacity to do it. And bottom line is that we're all better together.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for such powerful interaction with all of us. I thoroughly enjoyed the session, Sarah. For me, it was an eye-opener. Every time when I sit through your program, I get to see another perspective of the kind of work that we are involved in. Ladies and gentlemen, very soon we'll be doing a program around the Leadership Circle certification in India. So in case you're interested, if you can just type in the chat box, I am interested, IAI. If you can just write down IAI, I am interested in the chat box, we'll be more than happy to reach out to you and share the kind of work that I'm doing, that we are doing as an organization. Thank you so much. And we will reach out to you because very soon we'll be launching the next program here in India. We have just concluded a program 2.5 months back, and we were about to launch the program. However, because of this COVID-19, we had to scrap all our plans. Nonetheless, we are coming back again with another program where it would be fantastic for all of us to have you all in that program. Thank you so much for your participation, and thank you so much, Sarah, for an amazing session, a great eye-opening. Thank you. Stay blessed.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.